Elijah Carter, a successful black CEO, faces a vicious campaign of racial prejudice led by Officer Daniels, a corrupt cop determined to destroy him using false accusations and fabricated charges. As Daniels and the justice system attempt to dismantle Elijah's hard-earned success, Elijah uncovers a web of corruption within law enforcement, exposing systemic racism and bias. Despite the intense pressure, Elijah refuses to back down, fighting not just for his freedom, but to reveal the deeper injustices targeting him and others like him. The stakes rise as Elijah confronts the powerful forces working against him. Elijah Carter walked into the Rusted Spoon, a small but cozy diner tucked away on the corner of a quiet street in his hometown of Brookhaven. The air was filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee, sizzling bacon, and the comforting hum of soft jazz playing in the background. It was a place where everyone knew each other's name, where the world outside seemed distant, and the slow pace of small-town life lingered in the hearts of its residents. The bell above the door jingled softly as he stepped in, the familiar sound a small reassurance of the home he never fully left behind. Even with the success he had built in the corporate world, he wore no designer suits today, no polished dress shoes or gold watch to announce his presence. Just a simple black hoodie, dark jeans, and well-worn sneakers. Humble, unassuming, and exactly how he liked it when he was back in town. "Elijah!" The hostess, a cheerful woman in her mid-50s, called out with a smile that was both warm and genuine. "It's been a while, same as usual?" Elijah's lips lifted in a small smile as he nodded. "You know me too well, Carol." As she led him to a booth by the window, Elijah glanced around the diner, taking in the familiar faces. There were the Johnsons, sitting at the counter, deep in conversation about their son's latest football game. Across from them, the Martinez family enjoyed pancakes in a quiet celebration. It was peaceful here, unlike the pressure-filled world of boardrooms and high-rise offices he usually occupied. But peace, Elijah had learned, was sometimes hard to find. He sat down in the booth, the leather seat creaking slightly as he settled in, glancing out the window toward the busy street. The world beyond the glass was the same as it had been for years, but something had changed. The whispers he'd heard on the news about racism, corporate corruption, and systemic inequalities had begun to seep into his world, even here, in a place where he thought he could escape it. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He fished it out and glanced at the screen. Another call from his assistant, Michael. Elijah sighed, letting the phone ring through to voicemail. He'd made the decision to step away from the demands of his role as CEO of Carter Enterprises for a few days. There were too many things pulling at him, too many weighty decisions and expectations. What he needed was a moment to breathe, a moment to reconnect with the person he used to be before the world saw him as something different, before they saw him as a black man who owned one of the most successful tech companies in the country. His phone buzzed again, this time a text from his mother. "Are you going to check in with Aunt Lila today? She's been asking about you." Elijah smiled softly, shaking his head. Aunt Lila was one of the few people who didn't see the title of CEO or successful businessman when they looked at him. To her, Elijah was just her nephew, the one who used to run around in the yard playing basketball and eating peanut butter sandwiches after school. Her simple, loving way of looking at him always grounded him. A soft clink of plates caught his attention, and he turned to see Carol returning with a steaming cup of coffee and a stack of pancakes, the warm syrup dripping down the side in the most satisfying way. "Here you go, Elijah, just the way you like it." "Thanks, Carol," he said, his voice relaxed, as he took the cup in his hands and inhaled the comforting aroma. The diner was quiet this morning, the steady rhythm of clinking cutlery and quiet murmurs filling the space. But beneath the normalcy, something felt off. Elijah's gaze shifted to a table near the door, where a group of older men sat. They hadn't noticed him yet, but Elijah couldn't help but overhear the subtle conversation they were having, their low voices carrying in the silence of the diner. "And that CEO, Carter, have you heard of him? A black guy running a tech company? It's not right. Too many people looking up to him, thinking he's the model for success, just doesn't sit right with me." Elijah's grip on the coffee mug tightened for a moment, his heart quickening. He'd heard these kinds of conversations before, from all sorts of places. At business meetings, at charity galas, even at family gatherings. People would speak in hushed tones about his success, as if it was some kind of anomaly, a black man at the top of the corporate ladder, making waves in a world built on privilege. They'd never say it directly, but it was there in the undertone: he didn't belong. Elijah took a deep breath, forcing his muscles to relax, his posture to straighten. It was always like this. In every room he walked into, there was an invisible weight pressing down on him, a question he wasn't supposed to answer but one that was always there. "How did you get here?" He glanced back at the group, noting how they looked at each other with knowing smirks, the older man with the graying hair and plaid shirt making an unsubtle comment about young people these days thinking they can change the world. Carol came back by, setting down the syrup pitcher and glancing in the direction of the table Elijah had been watching. She must have sensed the shift in his demeanor, because she leaned in slightly, her voice quiet as she filled his cup. "Don't mind them, Elijah. They don't know the half of it." Elijah nodded and gave her a tight smile. "I know. Just feels like no matter how many times I prove myself, there's always someone waiting to remind me that I don't belong." Carol gave him a look of sympathy, her eyes filled with understanding. "Well, those of us who know you, we know what you've earned, and we're proud of you, Elijah. Never forget that." He smiled softly, appreciating her kindness. She wasn't just a waitress here, she was a constant, one of the few people who had seen him as Elijah Carter, the man, not the CEO. It meant more than she knew. He took a long sip of his coffee, letting the bitterness calm the anxiety that simmered beneath his skin. He had built an empire, earned respect in a world that made it hard for men like him to succeed. But that success never seemed to shield him from the deep-seated prejudices that lay just beneath the surface. There were always people ready to take his accomplishments and reduce them to something else, something unearned, something that couldn't possibly belong to someone like him. The hum of the diner continued around him, but Elijah's mind was somewhere else, distant, lost in thought. He wondered, as he often did, whether the fight was ever worth it. Every victory seemed hollow when the weight of prejudice was always waiting for him, just a breath away. "Mr. Carter," a voice broke into his reverie, and Elijah looked up, his brow furrowing slightly at the sight of a man standing by the door. The man was tall, well-dressed in an expensive suit, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. His posture was straight, confident, perhaps too confident. Elijah's gut tightened instinctively. "Is this seat taken?" the man asked, his tone a bit too casual, his smile a bit too wide. Elijah studied him for a moment, his instincts working overtime. There was something about this man that felt off. Not because of his presence, but because of the way he carried himself, as though he knew Elijah, but didn't quite understand the subtle power dynamic in the room. This was his place, his space. And the stranger, standing in the doorway of a diner that Elijah had frequented since he was a teenager, was an intrusion. "No, it's not," Elijah replied evenly, motioning to the empty seat across from him. The man walked over with a relaxed gait, but the underlying tension was clear. As he sat down, Elijah couldn't help but notice the slight tension in the man's movements. Maybe it was because he wasn't used to being invited to share space with someone like Elijah. Or perhaps it was because Elijah's presence here, unassuming, humble, was more unsettling than if he had walked in wearing a tailored suit. As the man settled into the booth, Elijah leaned back slightly, giving him a polite but pointed look. "How can I help you?" The man, undeterred, leaned forward slightly, the confident smile still playing on his lips. "Mr. Carter, I've heard quite a bit about you lately. Very impressive, what you've done with Carter Enterprises. You know, it's not often we see someone who looks like you in your position." Elijah's eyes narrowed, the smile on his lips never wavering. "I'm sure you've heard a lot. I've worked hard for what I have, but I don't think I know you." The stranger's expression tightened for just a fraction of a second, but he quickly masked it with a laugh. "Ah, apologies. I guess I was just hoping to talk about an opportunity, something that could benefit you. And us." The word "us" lingered in the air between them, and for a moment, Elijah felt the weight of the conversation shift. A conversation that was about to reveal much more than business. Elijah took a careful sip of his coffee, his eyes fixed on the stranger across the table. The man's smile was now tighter, his posture slightly more rigid as he adjusted his sunglasses, lowering them just enough to make brief eye contact. Elijah noticed the subtle change, a shift from casual to something more calculated, like the man had sized him up in the space of a few seconds and was now testing his limits. "So, Mr. Carter," the stranger said, his voice dipping into a tone that was too smooth, too rehearsed. "I've heard you've been involved in some philanthropic ventures lately, helping to fund educational programs in the community. Perhaps I'd love to talk about how someone like you can get more involved in opportunities that benefit us both." Elijah set the coffee cup back down, his brow furrowing ever so slightly. He could feel the discomfort in the air, a tension that was now unmistakable. The subtle undercurrent of judgment, like the man was positioning himself to gain something from Elijah, not out of respect, but because of an assumption. The assumption that because Elijah was black, he was here for something smaller, something less, as if he were a charity case, someone in need of an opportunity, rather than a man who had built something from the ground up. Elijah didn't let his smile falter. He'd learned long ago how to mask his frustrations, how to wear a facade of politeness, even when everything inside him screamed to react. It wasn't just a skill, it was survival. "I'm glad you've heard about the initiatives," Elijah replied calmly, leaning back in the booth and folding his hands neatly on the table. "I believe in giving back to the community, but I'm curious, what is it that you think I can bring to the table for you? Exactly, you seem to know a lot about me." The man's gaze flickered momentarily, as if the question had caught him off guard, but he quickly recovered, offering a sly grin. "Well, I'm just thinking it would be a good fit. You know, we have a few projects that need someone with your kind of influence, the kind of influence that could move things along more efficiently." His tone had shifted again, becoming more transactional, almost dismissive. Elijah's fingers tightened around his coffee mug. He could hear the subtext in the man's words. "Someone like you." The man was talking about his race, not his accomplishments. The idea that Elijah's influence in the business world could be useful to them, but only if it aligned with their preconceived notion of what a black man could do for them. But Elijah kept his cool. He'd had enough experience to know when someone was trying to manipulate him, when they saw his black skin and thought they could bend him to their will. What they didn't realize was that he wasn't a man who was easily swayed by offers that came wrapped in patronizing packages. He had earned his place at the top. No one had handed him anything. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else," Elijah said, his voice steady, though his eyes never left the stranger. "I don't chase opportunities, I create them." The man's smile faltered just for a moment before he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, I'm sure you do. I just think you're going to find the right kind of backing makes things move a lot faster in this town. We could really use someone who understands that." Elijah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the door, where a small group of local police officers had entered. They were chatting amongst themselves, laughing, but their eyes quickly fell on him as they noticed his presence. A quiet murmur passed between them before one of the officers, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a faded uniform, approached the counter, his eyes briefly lingering on Elijah. Elijah could feel the gaze, the weight of it. The man's look wasn't one of respect or even curiosity. It was one of subtle judgment, as if Elijah didn't belong in this place at all. As if, because of the way Elijah carried himself, his very presence was a disruption to the world these officers had built around themselves. The stranger across from Elijah cleared his throat, breaking his train of thought. "Mr. Carter, I think we could arrange a meeting sometime next week. I'll have my assistant reach out to you. We'll work something out." Elijah didn't move, still watching the officer at the counter, now speaking with Carol, his words hushed, but the body language unmistakable. The officer was staring straight at him, no attempt to mask his disapproval. "Absolutely," Elijah said, giving the man a firm nod. "Have your assistant reach out." He could feel the tension between them, but he didn't give the stranger the satisfaction of reacting. He had learned, through countless similar interactions, that reacting to people like this only played into their hands. But as he stood to leave, his calm demeanor was tested again. As he reached the door, one of the officers at the counter, leaning against the coffee machine, a large mug in hand, let out a small, condescending chuckle. "Man, it's funny, isn't it? How a guy who doesn't look like he belongs in these parts suddenly thinks he can play the big shot. The officer's voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, his words dripping with disdain, but still shrouded in the thin veil of a joke. Elijah froze. His hand rested on the door handle, but he didn't turn. The words stung, more than the officer realized, and for the briefest moment, he considered letting the anger rise, letting his frustration take control, but he knew better. He couldn't afford that. He couldn't let anyone see how much it hurt to be reduced to nothing more than the color of his skin, especially by someone in a position of power. Instead, he kept his composure, opening the door with deliberate calm, and as he stepped outside, he could hear the officer's laughter behind him. He walked to his car, the familiar sound of his shoes on the pavement providing a strange comfort in the face of everything he had just endured. He got in, closed the door, and started the engine. The air in the car felt thick with the weight of what had just happened. Another reminder that success was never a free pass, not for a black man. No matter how much he accomplished, there would always be those who would reduce him to his race. But as he drove away, the anger that had threatened to consume him earlier faded into something more dangerous, something more introspective. It was the kind of anger that was quiet and building, the kind that whispered to him that no matter how far he went, how high he climbed, this would always be his fight. He would always have to prove himself, always have to rise above. And it was exhausting. Elijah didn't know where to go next. He had a meeting in an hour, another business lunch he couldn't afford to cancel. But his mind was elsewhere, lost in the frustration that always seemed to accompany his interactions with people like the officers in the diner. People who saw the suit, the name, and assumed they knew everything about him. They didn't see the struggle, the quiet moments when he wanted to scream, when he wanted to just stop pretending to be something he wasn't. He drove aimlessly for a while, the city lights casting fleeting shadows as he passed through neighborhoods that were just as familiar as the ones he'd grown up in. When he'd reached a quieter part of town, away from the bustling business centers and polished high-rises, he pulled over. In the rearview mirror, he saw his reflection, suit jacket unbuttoned, tie loosened, eyes tired and distant, and he couldn't help but wonder how long it would take before the world stopped seeing him as the black CEO and started seeing him as just Elijah Carter again. That thought, the one that had been gnawing at him for years, settled in his mind as he stared into the dimming horizon. He had fought so hard to get here, but was it ever enough? Elijah's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove through the streets of Brookhaven, the hum of the engine echoing in the quiet of the early evening. His mind buzzed with frustration, replaying the encounter at the diner over and over again. The officer's words, the stranger's dismissive glances, it all added up to the same bitter reality. No matter how much success he achieved, no matter how many doors he opened, there would always be someone eager to tear him down. Someone who would see his black skin before his accomplishments. His phone buzzed again. Another call from Mitchell. His longtime lawyer and confidant Elijah didn't need to think twice before answering. "Elijah," Mitchell's voice came through, tight with urgency. "We've got a problem. I need you to come down to the courthouse. It's bad. They're moving forward with the charges, and the press has already started making noise. I don't think you're going to like what they're saying." Elijah's heart dropped. The press. What was Mitchell talking about? "What charges, what press?" he asked, his voice rising with concern. "Just get here, okay? We don't have much time." Elijah's stomach churned. He had been trying to keep a low profile, to stay out of the headlines, but now it seemed his world was about to be turned upside down. He didn't wait to hear more. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal, speeding down the road toward the courthouse, the tires screeching in protest. As he pulled into the parking lot outside the courthouse, Elijah could see the flashing lights of a news van parked along the curb. A reporter stood near the entrance, microphone in hand, with a cameraman beside him, ready to catch anything of significance. The sight was enough to make his stomach turn. He had never been a fan of the media circus, but now he could feel the weight of their gaze as it settled on him. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Elijah walked past security with barely a glance, his presence too commanding to be questioned. As he approached the main hallway, he spotted Mitchell, standing with his arms crossed, looking around nervously. When their eyes met, Mitchell's face tightened. "Elijah, Mitchell began, but his words were cut off by a sharp voice from down the hall. "Elijah Carter!" Officer Daniels' voice rang out, firm and cold, like a lash across the air. Elijah's body tensed immediately, his shoulders going stiff at the sound of the name. Officer Daniels, the same officer from the diner, stood in the doorway of a small room. He was flanked by two other officers, their postures rigid and accusatory, as if they were prepared to pounce on Elijah the moment he stepped forward. "What is this?" Elijah demanded, his voice steady but laced with barely concealed anger. He had no intention of backing down. Not now, not when things had reached this boiling point. Daniels stepped forward, his face tight with a strange mix of smugness and disdain. "We're arresting you for obstruction of justice and misconduct, Mr. Carter. You've been under investigation for your company's dealings, and I'm afraid this just isn't looking good for you." He paused for a moment, allowing the words to sink in. "We've received numerous complaints from employees, and considering your track record..." Daniels trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air like a shadow over Elijah's head. Elijah's eyes narrowed. This was it. The trap was set, and it was clear that Daniels was using his badge to manipulate the situation, trying to intimidate him into submission. Elijah took a step closer, his face calm but filled with an intensity that could almost be felt by those around him. "You don't have any evidence against me, Officer Daniels," Elijah said, his voice low and controlled. "This is a tactic to tear me down because you can't stand the idea of a black man like me at the top. You want to discredit me because you think I don't belong here." Daniels' expression flickered for just a moment, but it was enough to let Elijah know that his words had hit their mark. The officer straightened, his eyes hardening. "I'm not here to play games, Carter," Daniels said, his voice cold. "You can talk all you want about racism, but the truth is, you've been playing both sides of the fence for years. You've been hiding behind your success, your money, and your name. And now, well now, it's time for you to pay the price for your arrogance." Elijah's pulse quickened, but he remained steady. His mind raced, calculating his next steps, but his outward demeanor was unwavering. He knew he couldn't let this escalate. He had to play it smart. "I'm not going to let you provoke me into a mistake, Daniels," Elijah said, his tone unwavering. "You've got no case, you've got nothing but lies and your prejudices, so you can take your charges and..." But Daniels wasn't finished. "Don't think you're untouchable just because you've got money and influence," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "I've been on the force long enough to know how people like you work. You've built your empire on the backs of those who are too afraid to speak up. I'm going to make sure the world knows who you really are. You won't get away with this." Elijah stepped back, feeling the weight of the accusations settle into his chest. He could feel the suffocating pressure of the moment, the knowing looks from Daniels and the other officers. As if they had already passed judgment on him. He had dealt with systemic bias before, but this felt different. This was no longer a battle for respect. It was a battle for his freedom, his legacy, and his very identity. Mitchell stepped forward, his voice calm but urgent. "Officer Daniels, I think we've all had enough of these accusations. You're treading on dangerous ground here. Elijah has done nothing wrong, and you know it." Daniels barely acknowledged Mitchell, his eyes locked on Elijah as if he were the sole target in a firing range. "This isn't over, Carter. This is just the beginning." The other officers stepped closer, their postures threatening, but Elijah refused to be intimidated. He stood his ground, his jaw clenched, every muscle in his body alert. His mind raced as he realized that this wasn't just about him. It was about all the people like him who had been unfairly targeted, all the systemic barriers that had kept them from succeeding in a world that constantly made them prove their worth. "This ends now, Daniels," Elijah said, his voice hardening. "I will not let you destroy me. I will not let you destroy what I've worked for. If you think you're going to break me, you're wrong." For a moment, there was silence, tense, thick, and heavy. The other officers looked at each other, unsure of what to do next. Elijah could feel the weight of their doubt and hesitation in the air. They knew what Daniels was doing wasn't right. They knew this was personal, but they had no choice but to follow orders. The look on their faces was a mix of uncertainty and resignation, as if they were trapped between loyalty and the truth they knew they couldn't ignore. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, another officer, a younger man with a scruffy beard, walked into the room. He held up a piece of paper and spoke quietly to Daniels, who glanced down at it, his face tightening in disbelief. "This isn't good," the officer muttered, his voice barely audible. "The DA's office pulled the warrant. They're not moving forward with the case." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean they're not moving forward?" "They reviewed the evidence. There's not enough to proceed," the officer said, still holding the document. Elijah exhaled sharply, the knot in his chest loosening just a fraction. He could see the frustration on Daniel's face, but there was also a sense of defeat. The system wasn't going to fall in line as he had expected. But Elijah knew better than to think this was over. He could feel the simmering hatred beneath the surface. Daniels wasn't going to let this go, and Elijah wasn't going to let himself be cowed by the system any longer. He would fight for his dignity, for his legacy, and for the future of those who had been overlooked for far too long. As Daniels turned and stormed out of the room, the tension hung in the air, leaving a cold silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Elijah knew this was just a temporary victory, a brief respite before the storm would hit again. But he was ready. He had been fighting his whole life for a place at the table, and now, he was prepared to make them hear his voice. The next chapter was about to begin. Elijah stood still in the stark, cold hallway of the courthouse, his heart pounding, adrenaline surging through his veins. The words of Officer Daniels still echoed in his mind, each syllable dripping with contempt. The charges, the false accusations. He had expected them, but the reality of them now felt more like a slap to the face. It was as though the system itself had conspired to tear him down, to remind him that no matter how high he climbed, he would always be beneath the weight of the assumptions about his race, about his very existence. Mitchell, standing beside him, shifted nervously, casting glances toward the other officers in the room. "Elijah," Mitchell said quietly, his voice low enough to be barely audible. "This isn't over. We can't let them walk all over you like this." Elijah turned his gaze toward his old friend Mitchell. Despite his hesitant demeanor, had always been a voice of reason. A lawyer by trade, Mitchell was well acquainted with the undercurrents of power and the biases that could seep into the legal system. But even he looked rattled. Elijah could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "I know, Mitchell," Elijah said, his voice steady. "But the only way they get to me is if I let them." He paused, his brow furrowed in thought. "They want to humiliate me, make me look small, but I won't give them the satisfaction. I'm not some charity case for them to tear apart." Mitchell nodded slowly, but his brow remained furrowed, the tension between them thickening. "This isn't just humiliation anymore, Elijah. You've been targeted, and now they've brought in the press. This could get out of hand." The words hit Elijah like a physical blow. The press. That was the last thing he needed. The cameras, the reporters, all of them would latch onto this like vultures, dissecting every move he made, painting him as the villain in a story that wasn't even his. His name would be smeared across the news, and the business empire he had worked so hard to build could crumble in an instant. "Then we handle it," Elijah said, his jaw clenched in determination. "We fight back. We expose them, every last one of them." Minutes later, Elijah and Mitchell entered the courtroom, where a quiet hush fell over the room. The journalist who had gathered looked up expectantly, their eyes hungry for the latest scoop. Elijah's heart raced, but his face remained neutral, as if the weight of the moment didn't even faze him. At the front of the room, the judge, a stern man with graying hair, sat behind his desk, his gavel in hand. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Elijah could feel the eyes of the room on him as he walked down the aisle, his every step scrutinized. There were whispers, sharp glances, and the flash of cameras, as if the mere presence of a black man in the room had sent a ripple through the crowd. But Elijah held his head high. He would not cower. Not now. The defense lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman with a no-nonsense air about her, glanced at him briefly, a brief flicker of something unspoken in her eyes. He recognized the look. She knew exactly what was at stake here. She knew this wasn't just about the law. This was about something deeper, something more insidious. The judge slammed his gavel down, silencing the room. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice booming, "you stand accused of obstruction of justice and misconduct. Your actions have been under investigation, and as of now, we are moving forward with the charges." Elijah's stomach dropped, but his face remained impassive. The judge's words cut through him like a blade, and the weight of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about one man. It was about a system that had built itself on a foundation of bias and inequality. They didn't care about the truth. They didn't care about the work Elijah had put in to get here. They cared about control. The prosecutor, a man with a sharp face and an air of superiority, stood and began his opening remarks. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Mr. Carter has used his position and influence to block investigations into his company's dealings. He has obstructed justice by utilizing his wealth and power to intimidate employees and avoid accountability. Elijah didn't flinch. He knew exactly what they were trying to do. They were painting him as a villain, a manipulator, using his success as a weapon against him. They thought that by targeting him, they could weaken him, make him bend, but he wasn't going to give them that power. Mitchell leaned in close to Elijah, whispering so only he could hear. You're going to need to stay calm. They're not just after you, they're after everything you represent. Elijah clenched his fists beneath the table. He wasn't just fighting for his name. He was fighting for every black man and woman who had been overlooked, disregarded, and crushed under the weight of prejudice. He was fighting for every person who had been told they didn't belong. Mr. Carter, the prosecutor continued, his voice dripping with disdain. Your rise to success may seem impressive, but it's based on lies and deceit. You have systematically silenced those who have tried to expose you for who you really are. The words stung, but Elijah didn't let them show. He wasn't going to let this man, this representation of the system that had held him down, define him. The prosecutor turned to the jury, who sat in silence, eyes fixed on Elijah. We have witnesses, we have evidence, and we have the public's trust. Mr. Carter, you are not above the law, and you will be held accountable for your actions. Elijah's pulse quickened, but he didn't let the panic take root. He had prepared for this. Every move, every detail, he had known that this moment would come, and now, the time for strategizing had arrived. He stood up slowly, his tall frame commanding attention. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Your Honor, Elijah began, his voice calm but filled with an undeniable strength. I stand before you accused of crimes I did not commit. You may look at me and see a man with wealth and influence. You may look at me and assume I've used that to my advantage, but I'm here today because I believe in the truth, I believe in fairness, and I will not let the truth be twisted by lies and false accusations. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed as Elijah spoke, but he did not interrupt. Elijah continued, his voice rising with each word, his resolve hardening. The people who are trying to bring me down, Officer Daniels, the others, they want you to believe that my success is some kind of fluke, that I am a threat, but I'm not here to prove myself to you. I'm here to prove that the system that has targeted me for who I am, for what I represent, is broken. There was a murmur in the room, the jury shifting uncomfortably as they took in Elijah's words. Mitchell watched with an expression of disbelief and admiration. He had seen Elijah take control in countless meetings, but this was something different. Elijah wasn't just playing the game anymore, he was rewriting the rules. Elijah took a deep breath, letting the words hang in the air before he finished. I am not guilty of these charges, and I will fight for the truth, no matter what it costs. But what you need to understand is this. If I fall today, it won't just be my reputation that's ruined. It will be everyone who ever fought against the prejudices that seek to divide us. He paused, locking eyes with the prosecutor, then with the jury, and I won't let that happen. The room was silent. The prosecutor's face had hardened, his lips pressed into a thin line. The tension was palpable, as if the air itself had thickened in response to Elijah's defiance. The jury exchanged uncertain glances, and even the judge looked slightly taken aback by the weight of Elijah's words. But Elijah wasn't finished. This was just the beginning. He knew the fight wasn't over. What he didn't know was how far the system would go to bring him down, and whether his fight would be enough to expose the corruption that ran deeper than just one officer's bias. As Elijah sat down, his mind raced. The fight was far from over. But now, more than ever, he knew he couldn't back down. Not for himself, and not for anyone who had ever been silenced. The tension in the room grew unbearable, and Elijah's heart beat loudly in his chest. He had said his piece, and now he could only wait for the next move. But there was a shift in the atmosphere. Something had changed. The courtroom was on the brink of exploding. But what came next, Elijah knew, would determine everything. This section builds the tension to a peak, with Elijah finally standing his ground and making a powerful statement against the charges and the system attempting to bring him down. The stakes are raised, and Elijah's resolve is solidified as he prepares for the next phase of his fight. The courtroom was thick with tension as Elijah sat back down after his impassioned statement. He had just made it clear to the jury, the prosecutor, and everyone else in that room that he wouldn't be the one to bend or break. The air felt heavy, like the storm clouds before the thunder, everything waiting to explode. But it was far from over. The prosecutor, standing across from Elijah with a tight, calculating smile, wasn't done. The game was just beginning, and the real battle was yet to come. Elijah could feel the eyes of the room on him, each person sizing him up, ready to pass judgment. His breath was steady, even though his heart beat with a rhythm of urgency. He knew the stakes. He knew what was at risk. His career, his company, his life, they all hung in the balance. The prosecutor gave a nod to Officer Daniels, who had been quietly sitting in the back of the courtroom. As Elijah's eyes met the officer's, he saw something shift in Daniels' demeanor. Something cold, something calculating. Daniels was no longer just the officer who had tried to intimidate him at the courthouse. He was now a key player in this fight, and Elijah knew it. The officer stood up and walked toward the center of the room. The atmosphere grew heavy as his boots echoed off the floor with every step. He stopped in front of the judge, his posture rigid, and then turned to face Elijah with a look that could freeze anyone in their tracks. "Your Honor," Daniels said, his voice dripping with malice, "I'd like to submit new evidence. The defendant, Mr. Carter, has not been forthcoming with the truth. We've discovered financial discrepancies in his company's records, unreported transactions, and illegal dealings. This is not just about obstruction of justice. This is about a much larger conspiracy." The room fell into stunned silence. Elijah's blood ran cold, the room spinning for a moment as the weight of the accusation settled over him. Financial discrepancies, illegal dealings. The charges had gone from personal vendettas to an outright attack on his business and integrity. Elijah stood up slowly, his face betraying none of the panic he felt rising inside him. This wasn't just a baseless accusation. It was a calculated move, a direct attack on everything he had worked for. Officer Daniels had orchestrated this, used the media, used the legal system to spin a web of lies that could destroy him. Mitchell's face turned pale as he leaned in, his voice a whisper. "Elijah, we need to be careful. This is much worse than we thought." But Elijah wasn't backing down. He had been in this fight too long, too many times, to let it end like this. He stepped forward, his movements calm but purposeful. "Officer Daniels," Elijah said, his voice carrying through the room with a strength that demanded attention. "You've crossed the line. You've been trying to destroy me for weeks, trying to drag me down with lies and corruption. But this is beyond anything I ever imagined you'd sink to." Daniel's eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a sneer. "You think I'm the one who's corrupt, Carter? You think I'm the villain here? Look at you, hiding behind your wealth, your power. You've been playing the game for too long, and now you're going to face the consequences." Elijah could see the anger flickering in Daniel's eyes. This wasn't just about a legal case. This was personal. The officer wasn't just attacking his company. He was attacking Elijah as a black man in power, as a symbol of everything Daniels hated. Elijah wasn't just a CEO to him, he was a threat to the old order, to the system Daniels believed should never be challenged. The courtroom watched in hushed silence as Elijah and Daniels locked eyes, the tension thick in the air. It was a standoff, but Elijah wasn't about to let Daniels win. "You've been playing a dangerous game," Elijah said, his voice growing stronger with every word. "You've been hiding behind your badge, using it to manipulate the system and tear down people who have fought their whole lives to get where they are. And now, you're trying to use me as your scapegoat." Daniels bristled, but he didn't back down. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Carter. This is about justice, about making sure people like you don't get away with your lies. You've been making a mockery of this system for too long." Elijah's mind raced, but his body remained calm. He had faced worse. He had fought battles that no one thought he could win, and he wasn't about to let Daniels and his cronies win this one. "I'm not the one who's been lying, Daniels," Elijah said, taking a step toward the officer. "You've been running your mouth about financial discrepancies, about things you can't prove. You think that by attacking my business, you're going to break me? You think you can tarnish everything I've worked for with a few baseless accusations?" Daniels stepped forward, his face twisted in rage. "I'm not the one who's been lying. You're the one who's been hiding the truth. You think you're untouchable, Carter. You think that because you've built your little empire, you can do whatever you want, but that's not how this works. You're not above the law." The officer's voice had grown louder, each word dripping with venom. He was trying to provoke Elijah, to get him to lose control. But Elijah refused to let the officer see his weakness. He stood tall, his chin lifted, his eyes focused. "I am not above the law," Elijah said, his voice steady. "But neither are you, Daniels, and I'm going to make sure the world knows exactly who you are and what you've done." A low murmur swept through the courtroom. Elijah's words had struck a chord. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere as people began to take sides, began to understand what was really going on. Daniels wasn't just some officer doing his job. He was a man with a vendetta, and Elijah was determined to expose it. "I've got something for you, Daniels," Elijah said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a file. "This is a copy of the records you've been trying to hide. These are the real discrepancies, the ones you've been covering up in your department, your illegal dealings, your corrupt actions, everything you've been doing behind the scenes to manipulate the system." He slammed the file onto the judge's desk, the sound echoing through the room. Daniel's face drained of color as the papers were spread open, revealing the details of his corruption. His hands trembled slightly as he glanced down at the evidence. The courtroom was silent now. Everyone, from the jury to the spectators, had turned their attention to the file. The truth was out in the open. Daniels couldn't hide anymore. The judge looked from Elijah to Daniels, his expression unreadable. "This is serious, Officer Daniels," he said, his voice cold. "It seems that you have a lot to answer for." Daniels opened his mouth to speak, but his words were drowned out by the sound of footsteps approaching the door. The courtroom door opened, and in walked a group of officers, ones Elijah recognized, but not from the courtroom. These were good men, officers from another precinct who had heard about Daniels' corruption and had been investigating him for months. They had come to testify. "Your Honor," one of the officers said, stepping forward, "we've been working undercover on an investigation into Officer Daniels. We have more evidence, proof that he's been using his position to manipulate cases and destroy reputations. We can't let this continue." Daniels' eyes widened in disbelief as he realized the net was closing in on him. The weight of his own lies, his own corruption, had caught up to him, and now there was no escape. The judge, his face grave, turned to Daniels. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice, corruption, and abuse of power. You are no longer a member of this force." Daniels stumbled back, his face filled with shock and rage. "You can't do this. I'm a cop, But the officers moved quickly, handcuffing him as the room erupted into chaos. Elijah stood there, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the moment he had won. He had exposed the man who had tried to ruin him, who had tried to take everything from him. But even as the officers led Daniels away, Elijah knew this wasn't the end. There were still others out there, others who would continue to fight to keep him down, to keep people like him from succeeding. The battle had just begun. As Daniels was escorted out of the courtroom, Elijah stood tall, his heart still pounding. But now with a sense of clarity, the war for justice wasn't over. He had exposed one piece of the system, but there were more layers to peel back, and Elijah Carter would keep fighting, no matter the cost. This section delivers the climactic confrontation between Elijah and Officer Daniels, where the officer's corruption is exposed, and Elijah takes a stand against the injustice he faces. The stakes are high, and Elijah's strength and strategic thinking are on full display as he turns the tables. The revelation of Daniel's corruption adds gravity to the conflict, but the story ends with a sense of uncertainty. As Elijah knows, the fight is far from over. The courtroom was eerily quiet, save for the faint rustling of papers and the soft hum of the air conditioning. Elijah stood at the center, his back straight and his mind focused, as the prosecutor's voice echoed in his head, accusing him of crimes he did not commit. The whispers and rumors had followed him long enough, but this was different. This was the moment he would either prove his worth or watch his world collapse. The tension in the room was suffocating, the stares of the jury like daggers. It was a battle of wills, and Elijah had no intention of losing. The prosecutor had just finished his speech, painting a picture of Elijah as a manipulative businessman who used his wealth and influence to destroy anyone who dared to cross him. It was a narrative designed to appeal to the jury's biases, a story that fit their prejudices, and Elijah knew it, but he wasn't going to let it stand. He stood tall, his eyes fixed on the prosecutor. "Your Honor," Elijah began, his voice calm but unyielding, "I've been accused of things I did not do. These charges, these false accusations, are the result of a system that has been designed to silence people like me." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "But I'm not going to be silent. I won't be bullied into submission. Not by this courtroom, not by this system, and certainly not by Officer Daniels." At the mention of Daniels's name, a ripple of surprise swept through the room. The officer, who had been lurking at the back of the courtroom, his arms crossed and a smug look on his face, stiffened. It was clear he hadn't expected Elijah to call him out directly. Elijah turned, locking eyes with Daniels, who stood motionless for a moment. There was a slight twitch at the corner of his lip, a suppressed anger bubbling beneath the surface. But Elijah wasn't intimidated. "Officer Daniels," Elijah said, his voice steady, but filled with an unmistakable authority. "You've been gunning for me for a long time. You've used every opportunity to undermine my reputation, to spread lies about me, and today, you've brought me to this court, trying to take everything I've built." Daniel's eyes narrowed, and he took a step forward, his jaw clenched. "You think you can stand up here and lecture me about justice?" he sneered. "You've been hiding behind your money, your connections, thinking you can escape the truth. Well, I'm here to make sure you pay for everything you've done." The words hit Elijah like a slap, but he didn't flinch. He had heard it all before, from people who couldn't stand to see him succeed, from people who wanted to tear him down simply because of who he was. "I've earned everything I have," Elijah said, his voice rising, filling the room with the weight of his conviction. "I didn't get here because I was lucky. I got here because I worked harder than anyone else, because I fought for what's right, even when it wasn't easy. But you..." Elijah paused, locking eyes with Daniels. "You're here because you've been using your badge to push your personal vendettas. You've been trying to destroy me, not because of anything I've done, but because you can't stand the fact that a black man has built something for himself, something you think you can't control." There was a sharp intake of breath from the jury. The truth was out now, and it was impossible to ignore. Daniels took another step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. His face was flushed with anger, but there was something else in his eyes, something darker, something deeper. The contempt he held for Elijah was no longer hidden. "You don't get to stand there and lecture me about fairness," Daniels spat, his voice rising with every word. "You've been playing the system, manipulating people, using your position to get what you want. You think the rules don't apply to you because you've got money and power. Well, they do apply. And I'm going to make sure you face the consequences." Elijah's heart raced, but his mind was sharp. He knew this wasn't just about him. This was about a system that had been corrupt for too long, a system that had allowed men like Daniels to abuse their power. But it was also about something more, something personal. Daniels wasn't just trying to take him down professionally, he was trying to destroy everything Elijah had fought for, everything he represented. "You've been using your power to destroy lives," Elijah said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "And now, you're trying to do it to me, but I'm not going to let you. I've seen people like you my whole life, people who think they can hide behind the badge, behind their authority, and push everyone else down. But it's over, Daniels. This ends today." The room was tense, every eye on them as the two men faced off. Elijah could feel the weight of the moment, the years of struggle building to this single point. Everything he had worked for was on the line, but there was something else driving him. This wasn't just about him, It was about everyone who had been silenced, overlooked, and crushed by the system, and he wasn't going to let them down. Daniels opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, a voice cut through the tension. Enough. The judge, who had been watching the exchange with a growing sense of unease, slammed his gavel down. Officer Daniels, I've had enough of your interruptions. If you continue with this behavior, I will have you removed from this courtroom. Daniels' face twisted in fury, but he held his tongue. The room remained silent as the judge's words hung in the air. Elijah didn't let the opportunity slip away. I'm done being the target of your lies, Daniels, he said, his voice unwavering. And now, it's time for you to face the truth. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder, slamming it down on the judge's desk. This is the evidence I've gathered. Evidence of your corruption, your abuse of power, and your attempts to destroy me and anyone who stood in your way. The room went still as Elijah flipped open the folder. The pages were filled with details of Daniel's illegal activities, bribes, falsified reports, and threats against Elijah and his colleagues. It was all there, in black and white. Daniels froze, his eyes widening as he saw the documents in front of him. His face went pale as he realized what Elijah had done. The game was up. The truth was out. No, Daniels whispered, his voice trembling. This is all a lie. You don't know what you're talking about. Elijah stood firm, his resolve unshaken. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Daniels, and now the world will know too. As the room erupted in a flurry of activity, the prosecutor's face twisted in disbelief. The jury exchanged nervous glances. The truth had come out, and there was no going back. Your Honor, Elijah continued, this is what corruption looks like. This is what happens when people in power think they can get away with anything, but not anymore. Not on my watch. The judge, still stunned by the turn of events, looked at Daniels with a cold, calculated expression. Officer Daniels, I think you have a lot to answer for. You are hereby suspended from duty, and I'm ordering a full investigation into your actions. You will be held accountable for your abuse of power. Daniels' face contorted with rage. You can't do this, I'm a cop. You don't know what you're doing. But it was too late. The truth had been exposed. The corrupt officer who had once stood with authority was now a broken man, his reputation shattered, his future uncertain. Elijah turned to Mitchell, who stood beside him, his face filled with disbelief and admiration. We've done it, Mitchell whispered. You've done it. Elijah nodded, but his mind was already racing. He had exposed one piece of the system, but there was more work to be done. This wasn't over yet. There were still battles to fight, people to hold accountable. But for the first time in a long time, Elijah felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. The courtroom doors opened as officers filed in, preparing to escort Daniels out. But just as the tension began to break, a final, unsettling question hung in the air. What happens now? This section brings the confrontation to its emotional peak, with Elijah directly challenging Officer Daniels and exposing his corruption. The stakes are high, and Elijah's resolve and strategic thinking turn the situation in his favor. But the story ends with a sense of uncertainty, leaving the audience eager to see how the resolution will unfold. The courtroom buzzed with the quiet rustle of papers and the shuffle of footsteps as Officer Daniels was escorted out. His face was pale, his eyes filled with a mix of fury and disbelief, but there was nothing he could do now. The truth had come to light, and with it, his career, his reputation, and his entire life had crumbled. As he was led away, the weight of his actions, his years of corruption, was clear. There would be no escape, no quick fix. The system he thought he could manipulate had turned against him. Elijah stood at the center of the room, still gripping the desk where he had placed the evidence, his mind racing. He had won the battle, but the war for justice was far from over. As the officers began to file out with Daniels, a wave of quiet relief washed over him. The sting of everything he had endured, the racial prejudice, the constant undermining, had begun to fade into the background, replaced by the satisfaction of having stood up and fought back. Mitchell walked over, his face a mixture of awe and pride. I didn't think it was possible, Mitchell said quietly, glancing at the departing officer. You really did it, Elijah. You brought him down. Elijah looked at his old friend, the weight of the moment settling in. "It wasn't just me," Elijah replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It was everyone who believed in the truth, who was willing to stand up against the system that's been broken for far too long." He turned back toward the judge, who had been watching the events unfold with increasing shock. "Your Honor," Elijah continued, addressing the court with the same calm determination, "this isn't just about one officer. This is about a system that allows corruption to thrive. Daniels is just one piece of the puzzle. There are more like him out there. More people who abuse their power to destroy others." The judge nodded, his gaze steady but acknowledging the gravity of Elijah's words. "We will ensure that a full investigation is conducted into Officer Daniels' actions," the judge said, "and we will be looking into the larger system of corruption that has been exposed here today." Elijah nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment, but not yet satisfaction. His battle had won this round, but there were still many more battles ahead. Later that evening, Elijah sat in his office, alone, the weight of the day's events settling over him. The case was officially closed. Officer Daniels would face criminal charges, and the corrupt network he had helped sustain was beginning to unravel. But as the sun set outside the window, Elijah knew there was still much work to be done. His victory had exposed just one corner of the pervasive corruption that festered in the system, and he couldn't let that be the end of it. Elijah glanced down at the stack of papers in front of him. Files, reports, and proposals. He could have let it go, could have taken the win and retired to the quiet life that so many people expected of him. But he knew better. His journey wasn't just about personal success. It had never been. He picked up the phone and dialed Mitchell's number. "It's time to take this fight further," Elijah said when Mitchell picked up. "We need to start gathering resources, talking to the people who've been affected by this corruption. Daniels wasn't the only one. We need to make sure this never happens again." Mitchell's voice was full of conviction. "I'm with you, Elijah. This isn't over. We've only just begun." In the days that followed, the full weight of Elijah's actions began to unfold. The media, once ready to tear him down, now turned its attention to the systemic issues he had exposed. The coverage shifted from scandalous accusations to a deeper conversation about corruption within law enforcement and the broader justice system. Elijah's name, once synonymous with controversy, now represented a fight for integrity. Elijah knew the path ahead would be difficult. The forces he had challenged would not fade quietly into the night, but the seeds of change had been planted. His victory had become a rallying cry for others who had been silenced, others who had been crushed by the very system that was meant to protect them. People were speaking up now, coming forward with stories, with evidence, with the courage to expose the truth. The ripple effect of his fight had ignited a spark, one that could not be put out. One afternoon, as Elijah walked through the bustling downtown streets of Brookhaven, he felt the shift in the air. People no longer avoided his gaze or whispered behind his back. Now, there were nods of respect, smiles of acknowledgement, and brief exchanges of gratitude from the people he passed. It wasn't just about his success in business, it was about the stand he had taken, the difference he was making. As he approached a coffee shop, he noticed a group of young people gathered outside, holding signs that read, "We believe in justice and end corruption." Now they were talking, discussing, strategizing. Elijah paused for a moment, watching them, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. This was it, the beginning of something bigger. His fight wasn't just his own anymore, it had become a movement. One of the young men spotted Elijah standing at the edge of the group. His eyes widened and he rushed over. "Mr. Carter, thank you," the young man said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've inspired us. We've been trying to get the word out about what's been going on, and your case, it's made people realize that we can make a difference too." Elijah smiled, his heart swelling with the knowledge that his actions had sparked change. "It's not just about me," he said, looking around at the group. "It's about all of us. We're stronger when we fight together. We can create the system we deserve, but it's not going to be easy. You have to keep pushing." The young man nodded enthusiastically. "We're not stopping. This is just the beginning." Elijah continued walking, his pace slower now, his thoughts drifting to the future. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Elijah felt hopeful. He had faced the worst of the system and come out the other side, not only intact, but stronger. His journey had taught him that resilience, integrity, and the pursuit of justice were worth more than any success or title. But there was still work to be done. He wasn't done fighting, and he wouldn't stop until the system had truly been changed. That evening, as Elijah sat at his desk, reviewing the papers that had once seemed so daunting, a new sense of clarity filled him. The weight of the fight was still there, but now he knew what it was for. It was for the people who had been ignored, who had been made to feel small, who had been overlooked simply because of their race, their class, or their position in life. He leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. There would be more fights to come, more battles to win, but this moment, the moment when he had stood firm and exposed the corruption that had held so many back, was the one that would fuel everything else. He had come to understand something vital. It wasn't just about taking a stand for himself. It was about making sure others had the chance to stand too. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was Mitchell again. "Elijah, we've got an update," Mitchell said, his voice excited. "The investigation into Daniels and his network is already gaining traction. People are coming forward, and we've got a shot at not just taking down him, but reforming the whole system. You've ignited something big." Elijah smiled, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, but also the spark of something greater than himself. "It's just the beginning," he said quietly, "and we're just getting started." The story ends with Elijah standing strong, not just as a successful CEO, but as a man who had ignited a movement. His fight against corruption had opened doors for others, giving them a chance to raise their voices and seek justice. The system had been shaken, and though it would take time to rebuild, Elijah knew that his actions had made a difference, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been oppressed by the system. This section resolves the central conflict with Elijah, taking a stand against corruption and starting a movement for systemic change. The impact of his actions reverberates beyond his personal victory, suggesting a broader societal shift. The story ends with emotional closure, but leaves room for future exploration, ensuring the audience feels both satisfied and eager for what's to come.